for the final, and I'm suspecting also one of the best talks at the conference will be Andre Carus.
I have a handout. I have it here.
Goethe's Rejection. I'll take care of that now.
Okay. These are the originals of the quotes that I'm going to show you in English. Most of you can just throw it away, but a few people might want to check on what is actually there as opposed to my translations that you see up there. So this talk was originally supposed to be a kind of extension of Howard's paper on the enterprise of understanding and the enterprise of knowledge. I was going to expand Howard's story, not that it's incomplete in itself. I mean, it's a perfectly rounded out and coherent story. But I was going to expand it by expand his story, which is, tells the story of the development of the geometry of the color space.
I apologize to you guys, we just ran out of handouts.
Oh no,
So,
here's some more.
Maybe.
I made way too many because.
Well, I can't read German, so someone
Yeah,
can.
someone-
Like,
Now there's
Item 4 is in English.
Yeah, there's one quote from Howard's dissertation.
Right here, if anyone needs it.
So I was going to expand his story of the geometry of the color space, the main characters being Newton, Helmholtz, Kossmann, Maxwell, by bringing in the color phenomenological line of development from Goethe and David Brewster, Wilhelm Ostwald, and others, and show how, at latest in Helmholtz's work on color in the early 1850s, the two strands became intertwined. And I wanted to use that to see whether it sheds any light on the other thing, this somewhat mysterious enterprise of understanding, and see whether it could be pulled out of the shadows a little bit and made a little more concrete. I think that's probably an important thing to do, because I did notice a tendency in some of the talks here when this idea of understanding came up. It tended to be seen as largely a matter of just empirical interpretation. And I think that's obviously an important part of it, but I don't think that's all there is to it. I don't think that's all that Howard meant there to be to it. So I think it's worth exploring, but I found that just explaining who Goethe is and where he's coming from, because he's really out there as far as conventional philosophy of science is concerned, and why he mattered and why so many important people said things about him, already took me way beyond a 50-minute conference paper. So even that will be even that preface will be a bit abbreviated here, and I hope I can. If this conference ever gets published or anything, I hope I can come back to it and really go back to the original plan, because I really think it's worth doing, and I hope I can get something of that across, of why this might be interesting. Okay, so this is for Howard. He's not here, but does anybody know who this is? He's one of Howard's favorite characters. This is Anton Chekhov. And he, in a very well-known letter of 1886, he wrote a long letter to his dissolute artist brother Nikolai to get him to clean up his act and throw away the vodka bottles and read Turgenev instead of going to brothels and that sort of thing. But mainly he was urging him to get to work and focus on his art instead of moping around feeling sorry for himself. The famous part of that letter is Chekhov's list of 8 criteria for being a civilized person, which is what he wants his brother to become. But also, in passing, he holds up Newton and Goethe as examples or models of civilization. I thought, why those two? And those two in combination. And I happened to show this to Howard once too, and he also shook his head. You can imagine him sort of stroking his beard. Since Chekhov was, of course, an educated man, and in fact a scientifically educated man, he was a doctor, and would have been aware that Goethe had notoriously devoted a substantial part of his middle and old age to a one-man crusade against Newtonian science, and indeed against Newton himself, with personal invective and against, casting doubt on the optics. So fanatically single-minded was this crusade, in fact, that Goethe actually said that his Farbenlehre, his theory of colors, first published in 1810, was more important and gave him a greater claim to undying fame than all his literary achievements put together. Now, it's certainly true that the theory of colors has served as a rallying point for anti-scientific minds and movements ever since. Rudolf Steiner, for instance, notoriously made the Farbenlehre into the foundation of his anthroposophy and of the educational program of the Waldorf schools, where it still has a high-profile role. And lots of examples like that. But Goethe's explicit hope to be the Martin Luther of the scientific church, with presumably Newton as the St. Peter, anyway, was a hopeless undertaking, and from our viewpoint, 2 centuries later, it just seems amazing that a reasonably well-informed and intelligent observer of 18th century intellectual life could ever have entertained such a deluded hope for a moment, let alone sustained this effort for decades. But as I've thought back on Chekhov's remark to his brother over the years, it's come to seem a little more natural for a scientifically educated literary mind to bracket Newton and Goethe together and to ignore the distance that Goethe so perversely put between them, especially since Chekhov himself was not only a practicing doctor, but also in his stories and plays, combined so strikingly an unsparing, unsentimental, almost surgical willingness to face the worst about the human condition. And I think this is why he appeals to Howard as well, with an unfailing sense of pity, of human sympathy, and especially of sympathy to the ideals of his sometimes rather hopeless characters. For him, it might well have seemed of critical importance never to lose either of those two poles from sight, even if they couldn't be reconciled conceptually. Anyway, here's the one pole. This is Goethe. And so it seemed also, at least in German-speaking Central Europe, to many scientists and philosophers of the 19th and 20th century, Goethe's rejection of Newton was long the focus of discussion along the lines that since the 60s, since C.P. Snow, we tend to put under the heading of the two cultures. I could spend the rest of the talk just briefly touching on all the great scientists between 1810 and 1960 who thought it worthwhile to dwell on this Goethe versus Newton thing, but I'll stick to a few examples. And everybody had a somewhat different take on the matter. Even good friends and scientific allies could disagree sharply about it, as we can see from the divergent views of Helmholtz, for instance, and of his close friend Émile Dubois-Reymond. Not only were they lifelong friends who had studied together, had both been associates of Johannes Müller in Berlin in the 1930s and worked closely together later, but they were also personally close. They often talked. They were scientific allies, as I said. They were best men at each other's weddings. Their views of Goethe, though, could hardly have been more different. Helmholtz gave two different lectures, very well-known lectures on Goethe, one near the beginning of his career. This is the conservation of energy Helmholtz at the top. It was this first lecture in the early 50s was appreciative of Goethe as an observational scientist, although it concluded that ultimately the poet had got in the way of objective scientific judgment, it argued that given his situation, his primitive apparatus, the knowledge of light at the time, Goethe, given his priorities, couldn't have done much better. The second lecture in the 1890s is much more effusive, and it portrays Goethe as, especially in his biological and morphological work, as an important forerunner of Darwin's evolutionary theory, which of course had been published in between the two lectures. In the second lecture, Helmholtz puts much more emphasis on the importance of imagination and creativity in science and of going against the grain. He points out, for instance, that Faraday, too, had been an outsider to the scientific establishment, just like Goethe, and had rejected abstraction just as vehemently as Goethe. In between Helmholtz's two papers, between these two Goethe papers, that is in 1882, Dubois-Reymond gave his famous talk to the Berlin Academy entitled Goethe und kein Ende, meaning something like, when will there be an end to all this Goethe crap? He excoriates his colleagues in the strongest words in both the sciences and the humanities with withering sarcasm for having dragged on the discussion of Goethe's supposed scientific merits for so long, when it should have been blindingly obvious to any reasonably literate person that Goethe just had no clue what he was talking about, had been mathematically illiterate, had completely misunderstood Newton from beginning to end. I've often wondered about this, the background to this and other philosophical disagreements between Helmholtz and Dubois-Reymond. I haven't been able to find any discussion of it in the literature, or any clues in their writing, or at least in their published correspondence. I've never been in Berlin for long enough to sort of be able to go to the archive and actually have a look. But if any of you comes across anything, it's a peculiar thing because they really were very close friends, and they said these really diametrically opposite things. Strictly speaking, of course, it's not a question of reconciling the two cultures in our sense, literary and scientific, since Goethe was himself, in fact, a scientist with an honorable place in the history of biology. Helmholtz wasn't exaggerating. Even Darwin, in fact, acknowledged Goethe as a forerunner. But Goethe also made contributions to and participated in a lot of other academic debates in lots of fields, and meteorology and geology and other things. He just goes on. He was also a university administrator. As the minister in the Weimar government in charge of everything cultural and intellectual, he was officially the head of the University of Jena, whatever they called it, the rector or something. But the administrative head of the University of Jena focused a good deal of attention on, especially on its scientific faculties, to ensure that good people were recruited and that their laboratories were properly equipped. So Goethe's attack on Newton and mathematical science was not motivated by a hostility to science as such, but to what he saw as a new orthodoxy within science that subordinated the live, real-time, individual perception of natural processes too much to abstract idealizations. It's a little bit along the lines of something you see a century later, or a century and a half later, a little more than that, a little less than that, in Husserl's protest against the excesses of Galilean science in the Crisis in the 1930s. It's a recurring theme, of course, but Goethe was one of the first sort of really sort of strongly rhetorical articulations of this. Of course, it could be said that part of Goethe's originality as a scientist was motivated directly by this oppositional attitude, and we often see this kind of thing. Michael has drawn attention, for instance, to Ørsted's motivation by Schelling's Naturphilosophie. Schelling, by the way, was directly inspired by Goethe's example during his time in Jena, during Schelling's time at Jena, and also by Goethe's particular doctrines in the Farbenlehre, though Schelling put them into a post-Kantian idealist context that Goethe completely rejected. Goethe was kind of at the other extreme. He was and remained, maybe until his old age, the kind of naive realist that Moore and Russell became at first when they rejected Hegelianism around 1900. Russell later said, for instance, "I felt a great liberation, as if I had escaped from a hothouse onto a windswept headland. In the first exuberance of liberation, I became a naive realist and rejoiced in the thought that grass is really green." Now, of course, in ordinary parlance and ordinary life, the thought that grass is really green is perfectly intelligible, but Goethe clearly wanted to go well beyond that, or rather, he wanted to refute the challenge to that, to the ordinary Lebenswelt that Newtonian science seemed to him and to many others to present. He wanted to restore the ordinary natural way of seeing and knowing to its traditional rights and privileges. He said stuff like this here. Now the numbers here are keyed to those quotes for those of you who want to read the original rather than my translations here. The human individual himself, insofar as he employs his healthy faculties, is the greatest and most precise physical apparatus, and it's the very downfall of modern physics that experiments have been essentially extruded from the human person, and that we want to know nature only by what artificial instruments show. And it's the same with calculation, with mathematics. It's also makes everything too abstract. And this hostility to abstraction goes hand in hand with what looks at times like a really radical empiricism. Oops, sorry. Yeah, there it is. Okay. The most sublime thing would be to grasp that everything factual is already theory. One need not look for anything behind the phenomena. They are themselves the doctrine. This maxim, this aphorism, is often quoted by Ernst Cassirer, who you see here, this pleasant large man on the left next to this nasty little man on the right, the collision between these two, Michael wrote a book about, a nice little book about, that I actually published at the time. And Carnap is there in the background somewhere, sneaking around. This was in...
Hiding behind Casino.
Anyway, Ernst Cassirer not only quotes that aphorism that I just showed you very often, I think I've come across it at least a dozen times in his various books, but his philosophy of symbolic forms, the sort of main work of the 1920s, his life's work, is also probably the most sustained and thoroughgoing effort ever undertaken to reconcile Goethe and Newton at a conceptual level.
Mm.
The idea of the philosophy of symbolic forms was first enunciated in a discussion of Goethe and mathematical physics in 1921. Cassirer says that the irresolvable conflict between them can only be led towards a solution if we place Kant's Copernican revolution in a larger context and don't just limit it to the systems of knowledge, values, and art that Kant himself applied it to. To encompass Goethe's concerns, he says, we need to extend the Copernican revolution to ordinary language and even to the more primitive forms of mythical thinking. These different articulations of the same substrate, the same world, are incompatible with each other, but none has access to the absolute underlying object. Only when we investigate the particular approaches and limits of each one in turn can we say anything about the whole that they each approach from a different angle. For Cassirer, actually, the poles of the envisaged reconciliation were not Goethe and Newton himself directly, but Goethe and Kant, although Cassirer is quite clear that there's no getting around Kant's total commitment to Newtonian science in all relevant respects, and we saw a lot of details to that effect from Michael yesterday evening. But given Cassirer's own lifelong attempt to find such a synthesis, it's hardly surprising to find that Goethe needed to make Kant and Goethe compatible, and so as a historical witness to their compatibility, he's a little bit of a suspect witness. He bends over backward to find and put great stress on every conceivable affinity between them, even when that means bundling the Newtonian aspects of Kant into the background of it. Now, Howard has not, so far, written anything about Goethe, as far as I know, but has, of course, written a lot about Newton, and also about Locke, who was another radical skeptic about the possibility of scientific knowledge. Howard has also always been concerned, like Helmholtz, Ostwald, Cassirer, and many others who tried to mediate between Goethe and Newton, to keep something like these two poles represented by them, these same two sets of priorities in view. Howard calls them different names in different contexts, but in one of his most recent papers, he's actually given them names as the enterprise of knowledge and the enterprise of understanding. Understanding has actually always been a constant theme in his work, long before that, even going back to his dissertation, but he has never tried to reduce it to a formula or develop a standard terminology. He's always coming at it from a somewhat different angle. Above the concluding chapter of Howard's dissertation, just as an illustration that it starts then, or before then, is the last paragraph of the introduction to Raum, Zeit, Materie, which comes at the end of a plea, a long and extended plea by Weil for the continued interpenetration of physics and philosophy. And Weil says, all beginnings are dark in the sense of obscure. Especially the mathematician who operates with his concepts in his developed science in strict formality needs to be reminded from time to time that the origins hark back to darker depths than his methods can encompass. Beyond all special knowledge, there remains the task of understanding. Despite the discouraging spectacle of philosophy teetering back and forth from system to system, we can't give it up altogether if knowledge is not to degenerate into a pointless chaos. And then more recently, in this same spirit of Weil's, Howard says, in that paper I mentioned, understanding without knowledge is empty, knowledge without understanding is impossible. The question is now, and that's what I want to address, is to what extent is there any overlap between Goethe's demand for a more intuitive and immediate kind of understanding and anything that Howard would remotely recognize as understanding, even with his resistance to pinning it down too precisely. Now, obviously you will recognize that that is in itself not a very precise question. For one thing, Goethe is devilishly difficult to pin down. He says all sorts of things that might weigh on one side of this question or the other, and the judgment call is where to discern some sort of central tendency. I'll try to give a brief overview of some of the challenges that would have to be addressed. But of course, one wants to also have a guide to how to sort of package this, how to interpret what Goethe was doing. And one way of exercising interpretive charity in this task, in a peculiarly Kantian way, is suggested by Howard himself in his dissertation. One of the themes of his dissertation, for those of you who aren't acquainted with it, is the question of which philosophies are compatible with science. Actually, Howard approached the question historically, of course, by considering a specific example, and asks which philosophies are compatible with the program of strict mechanism, which he has spent much of the dissertation describing the development of in detail. And he specifically, as the sort of standard of what he means by it, he has a long passage from Helmholtz's 1847 paper on the conservation of energy. The philosophies of Leibniz and Kant are judged to be compatible with it, but not Descartes. Spinoza also passes, by the way, which is interesting in the present context, since Spinoza was one of Goethe's great heroes. Along the way, Howard considers the evolution of the Kantian system from the Leibnizian one. With respect to this thing of whether it's consistent with strict mechanism, the philosophy of Kant is, quote, in Howard's dissertation, quite the same as the philosophy of Leibniz, from which Kant differs ontologically only by including no doctrine on the character of the noumenon. Then a bit further on, Howard talks about Kant's second mathematical antinomy of pure reason, whose two sides, first, every composite substance is made up of simple parts, and second, nothing that exists is simple. Leibniz had both held, the first applied to substance, the second applied to bodies, which are not substances but appearances. Kant obviously rejects them both with respect to noumena because of the unknowability of the Ding an sich, but he also rejects their application to things in space, the metaphysics of experience that Michael was also talking about yesterday. There's on the handout there's a long paragraph at which this comes at the end. Both propositions presuppose the complete analysis of conditioned, experienced things, the one supposing this analysis to terminate in the simple, i.e. in the unconditioned, while the other supposes the actual complete analysis to be infinite. It is part of Kant's doctrine that the demand for completeness, which he attributes to the pure reason, can be regarded as legitimate only when it is taken as a regulative principle guiding inquiry, not when it is taken as a constitutive principle governing reality. And strict mechanism itself, Howard indicates, should be regarded as a program, a regulative idea, rather than a theory or a doctrine, a constitutive idea. And he concludes this section on the appraisal of the mechanistic program by agreeing with Kant's conclusion that, in his paraphrase, whatever doubts or even convictions of impossibility are justified of the application to what is ultimately real of the conceptions of natural science, the actual investigation of nature should be guided by the maxim to seek always to extend the application of principles. And here he quotes that favorite passage of the Marburg school of Neo-Kantian philosophers that Casillo belonged to, where Kant says that although we can never know an object completely, it is not given, not gegeben, it is aufgegeben, assigned as a task. The pun gets lost in the translation. So the demand of pure reason remains valid, not as an axiom, but as a problem. So what I'd like to consider here is whether there is a program or Aufgabe that Goethe, which one might regard as the diametrical opposite, in a way, to the mechanistic program, that Goethe might, in theory at least, or maybe someone speaking on Goethe's behalf, or a tidied up Goethe a couple of centuries after his death, have been able to retreat to without compromising the basic commitments of his doctrine. Well, what were those central doctrinal priorities? That's a highly controversial question, and there's one huge obstacle that has to be addressed right up front before we consider anything else, which is the tenacity of this naive realism I mentioned earlier. It was this commitment to the world really being, as we perceive it, the grass really being green, that led him to what Wilhelm Ostwald, one of the most intelligent commentators on Goethe's Fabelnehmer, regarded as his fundamental mistake. If Goethe had conceived of the theory of colors as primarily a physiological science, he could have told himself that its physical presuppositions are a question that rests on a completely different foundation. Instead, he draws the false inference from the unity of the sensation of light to the unity of its physical cause, sunlight, and thus considers it to be his scientific task to provide a new physics of light, in which that unity is an obvious, i.e. not further tested, presupposition. It was in the realm of the physiology and psychology of human color processing, after all, Ostwald points out, that Goethe made his important positive contributions to color science, which were indeed picked up and developed under Goethe's direct influence by such major figures as Purkinje and Johannes Müller, and indeed in the next generation by Ostwald himself, in his own Fabelnehmer. Both Helmholtz and Dubois-Reymond, by the way, had been students of Johannes Müller, who was one of these people that was directly influenced by Goethe's physiological color findings. Now, this fundamental mistake of conflating the physiology of color with the physics was then further compounded, Ostwald continues, by Goethe's misconception about the conceptual procedure of science. As the basis of his alternative physics of light, Goethe wants to claim that Newton's compoundness of sunlight and the production of colored lights from it by refraction are derived phenomena, while the fundamental or basic phenomenon, the Urphänomen, as he calls it, is the production of colored lights in turbid media by the interaction of the polar opposites, light and darkness. And what he says about the Urphänomen is, in this spirit we consider the error committed by natural science to be very grave, of putting a derived phenomenon at the top, but the basic phenomenon at a lower level. And even the derived phenomenon was stood on its head, and so forth and so on. But if then such a basic phenomenon is identified, there's still the problem that one doesn't want to acknowledge it as such. Then we search out something behind it or above it, where we should surely admit the limits of our seeing. The natural scientists should let the basic phenomenon, the Urphänomen, rest in their eternal peace and magnificence. However, Ostwald points out, Goethe provides no criteria for distinguishing fundamental from derived phenomena. seems to rest everything on his own initial flash of insight, his aperçu about the nature of light when he first began to think about it. And in contrast to Newton, who, as Howard has so often shown in different contexts, was willing to leave certain fundamental concepts as provisionally undefined, black boxes, to be investigated down the road. Goethe took a dogmatic approach here, insisting that when we reach an Urphänomen, we have simply come up against the limits of inquiry, or of our cognitive or perceptual capacities, and have to accept it as basic. So Goethe's own rigidity and dogmatism, the very qualities that he attributes to Newton and the Newtonian church, greatly exceeded Newton's in at least these two respects. First, Newton was willing to give explicit arguments why what he considers fundamental is fundamental. And second, Newton didn't insist, like Goethe, that whatever he identified as fundamental was to be left unquestioned, but regarded it only as a provisional stopping point, about which he didn't claim to know any more than could be shown empirically. This rigidity and dogmatism seems to derive at bottom from Goethe's stubborn commitment to this naive realism. Can there be any backing off from such a deeply rooted doctrine to a mere program, from Gegebenes to an Aufgegebenes? Well, Cassirer, in his efforts to reconcile Goethe with Kant, is able to find a few shreds of evidence that Goethe did indeed sympathize with certain aspects of Kantian philosophy. In terms of Kant's maxim, for instance, that thoughts without content are empty, while sensory intuitions without concepts are blind, Goethe clearly resonated to the first part, that thoughts without content are empty, which Cassirer regards as a neat summary of the entire transcendental analytic. Cassirer points out, for instance, that in Goethe's personal copy of the Critique of Pure Reason, the passage is heavily underlined in approval, where Kant says that everything the understanding creates out of itself, without having borrowed it from experience, can only be for the purpose of application to experience. One wonders, though, why Goethe should then have been so affronted by Newton's application of geometry to light and colors. And also, why is it okay to apply mathematics to celestial phenomena, but not to light and colors? So it's clear, yes, it's clear that Goethe did like the Critique of Judgment and was favorably disposed to certain other aspects of Kant, but that obviously doesn't amount to a reconciliation of Newtonian science. I think Cassirer has a better case for Goethe's old age, when he'd begun to back off from the strictness of this earlier naive realism, or whatever you want to call it, to a position where he was willing, at least in some context, to regard the Lebenswelt, the immediate experience, as a symbol for something unknown or not directly accessible. This is apparently the attitude that he took in his last years, for instance, towards his idea of the Urpflanze, or the original plant, which he thought all of the plant kingdom had originally derived from, which he once thought he'd actually discovered a specimen of, and then sort of backed off that in his old age. There's also support in the literary works, and some things that Cassirer misses, like Helmholtz, for instance, cites the famous line at the conclusion of Faust Part 2, alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis, everything transitory is but a parable, as evidence that the old Goethe no longer took sense perception quite so literally. Cassirer admits that Goethe's conception of Kant was somewhat eccentric, to put it mildly, not one anyway that he, Cassirer, would recommend for a textbook on the history of philosophy. But let's assume for now that there is some basis for Cassirer's reconciliation efforts, and that Goethe really did retreat to some degree from the full-strength naive realism that had motivated the earlier dogmatism. But there's more behind Goethe's insistence on the world really being as we see and experience it than just this naive realism. Cassirer disagrees with Ostwald's diagnosis of Goethe's fundamental mistake, the conflation of the physical and psychological, the physics and the physiology or psychology, and says that the path of just restricting himself to the physiology or psychology of color processing and ignoring the physical basis was not open to Goethe because of his holism. His insistence that any judgment about nature couldn't be made in isolation but had to consider the entirety of nature. It's Newtonian passages like this one. In living nature, nothing happens that isn't tied into a connection with the whole. And if the experiences appear but isolated to us, this doesn't say that they are isolated. So, and this view, Casilla says, necessarily extended Goethe's project to the physical basis of color. It doesn't permit him to restrict his attention to just the specific color processing of our species. The fundamental physiological insights of the theory of colors lay in Goethe's path, but didn't make up the actual and final goal he had in view, for his intent wasn't fixed on just opening up and finding out about new subdivisions of nature, but primarily on a more comprehensive view of it. What was decisive for him was not the specific individuality of the objects and the phenomena, but the nature and direction of the inquiry itself. This is the point, interestingly, where Casilla then says that to get a better perspective on this Goethean demand of wholeness or totality from a philosophical or a Kenntniskritischen viewpoint, we need to step back and entertain some more general reflections, and that's where he then sets out his 5-page program for the philosophy of symbolic forms. So the Goethean demand for wholeness, at least in its first statement, seems to be what motivates Casilla's whole philosophy of symbolic forms. But one could certainly take issue with Casilla's interpretation of Goethe here. Elsewhere, Casilla himself emphasizes that it was precisely the concrete individuality of a particular specimen, a particular object, a particular human individual that Goethe wanted to save in the face of the Newtonian steamroller that was flattening everything to the same level. Besides, just as the extreme form of naive realism seems, at least according to Casilla himself, to have been amenable to some degree of compromise in the end, so this demand for wholeness, for totality, has limits too. Goethe understood perfectly well that there were degrees of this demand, and criticized forms of it that were more extreme than his own. And I have a couple of quotes for that, but I'm skipping those now so that I can get done in some reasonable time here. So anyway, it's clear that it's not a choice between wholeness or particularity, but rather there's a continuum of gradations in between, and Goethe was not by any means the holistic extreme. What certainly can be said is that Goethe was far from wanting to exorcise certain hard questions or put them to sleep in the hope that we might feel more at home in the world, like a certain philosophy that Howard criticizes in this context, in this paper. Helmholtz had a point, I think, that Goethe's response to Newtonian science was at least partly an aesthetic one. Ostwald, too, points out that you have to understand Goethe's whole motivation in the Farbenlehre, originating an attempt to produce something like a system of color harmony, like the musicians have for as a kind of grammar for what they do, for the purposes of talking coherently about color harmony in painting. Goethe was, after all, along with all those other things, a prolific art critic, like his hero Diderot. And the aesthetic response toward his gut reaction to Newton was not so much to the optics itself, and even Casilla agrees with this, but to the materialistic extrapolations from Newtonian mechanics that he'd encountered in his youth. For instance, d'Holbach's Système de la Nature, which he read when he was a student in Strasbourg with Herder, and in the early 1770s, and he says, "We couldn't understand how such a book could possibly be dangerous. It seemed so gray and Cimmerian, so death-like, that it took us an effort to tolerate its company. We shivered in its presence as if it were a ghost. How hollow and empty we felt in this sad atheistical twilight in which the earth with all its formations, the sky with all its constellations disappeared," and so on and so on. Yeah. All this we would even have accepted if the author had really built up from matter in motion the world before our eyes. But all he does is sort of plant down a few generalities and then immediately leave them behind, and sort of claims he's derived something. And, once again, there's a parallel here with Russell and Moore, as Russell later wrote about that conversion experience, when they left Hegelianism behind. With a sense of escaping from prison, we allowed ourselves to think that grass is green. The world, which had been thin and logical, suddenly became rich and varied. That seems to be the sort of response that Goethe had, and well, many of his generation had, to these more extreme articulations of the materialist worldview, which they interpreted as just simply stemming straight from Newton. But Goethe's response to this thin and logical world of D'Holbach, and he thought Newton, was not just an aesthetic response. He understood perfectly well that the aesthetic response was irrelevant in cognitive contexts. It's easy to miss, but Goethe was actually strongly committed to an ideal, a peculiar ideal, but definitely an ideal of objectivity. And admittedly, it's sometimes very well concealed. When you read something like this, for instance, you'll wonder what on earth I could be talking about. We can't help, this is in the Fabelnehmer itself, in the polemical tile where he's attacking Newton. We can't help but point out that by means of experiences and experiments, nothing can really be proven. The phenomena can be observed with great precision, experiments can be carried out tidily, experiences and experiments can be arranged in a certain order, you can infer one phenomenon from another, you can describe a certain district of knowledge, you can lift your opinions to a level of greater certainty and completeness. And I would have thought that would be quite enough. Consequences from all that, on the other hand, everyone draws for himself. Nothing can be proven from it. Least of all, abilities, refrangibility, and nesses. Everything to do with opinions about things belongs to the individual. And we know only too well that conviction depends not on insight, but on the will. We know that no one grasps anything but what works for him and what he can therefore invent. So it all goes back to prejudices, which means judgment before the investigation. So this is like an extreme form of what did you call it again? Where there's no external validity at all.
Didn't have a name for
You
it.
talked about external validity of experiments.
It's you only learn about the thing in front of you.
Yeah, right. So, zero external validity. So how could you get more subjectivist than that? But actually, I think Cassira is right to stress Goethe's commitment to what he called gegenständliche Denken, thinking in terms of objects. I would call it objective thinking. And the impersonal objectivity of procedure in the Fabelnehmer, at least. Goethe understood very well that science requires a different mental attitude from everyday life, let alone from art, where mostly we respond to our surroundings according to our preferences. And what's useful or useless to us, in science we have to adopt a different attitude. A much more difficult task is shouldered by those whose lively impulse towards knowledge strives to observe the objects of nature in themselves and in their relations among each other. For they soon miss the orienting scale, the ruler that came to their aid when they considered things as humans in relation to themselves. They miss the scale of liking and disliking, of personal attraction and repulsion, of usefulness and harm. They are to abstain entirely from it. They are to search and research what is rather than what they want. Like disinterested and practically godlike creatures. Thus, neither the beauty nor the usefulness of plants are to affect the proper botanist. He is to examine a plant's construction and its relation to the realm of other plants, and so on. Now, you might call this a subjective account of objectivity, or an account of what it feels like to adopt an objective attitude, but I think it's fairly clear that what he's talking about, that he's obviously rejecting the relevance of an aesthetic response to scientific knowledge. You can also see how it fits with Goethe's naive realism, discussed earlier, this sort of immediacy. Goethe's entire preoccupation with science originated, after all, in his desire to overcome this kind of extreme subjectivity that he had addressed in Goethe, the novel that had instantly made him a European celebrity at age 25 and made everyone, from Napoleon on down, want to meet him. Goethe wanted something stable and reliable to hang on to, something external, to save him from the chaos of purely internal wallowing. He did not, as he went out of his way to emphasize, sympathize with a subjectivist philosophy like that of Hegel or Schelling, and often distanced himself from the literary subjectivism of the Romantics. So his idea seems to have been, and I realize this is not very articulate, but just somehow trying to summarize what he seems to be sort of gesturing at, that nature has an objective reality, but each of us perceives it according to our own individual perspective. What can be objectively found out are reproducible experimental results, or perhaps groups of related results. But obviously this immediately starts to get a bit problematic when you start thinking about what could relate one experiment or observation to another. I mean, when he talks here about being able to deduce one experiment from another, I mean, what does he mean by that? What kind of deductive relations is he talking about? Anyway, there's no neutral theoretical truth about nature. There's just the common substrate to what each of us experiences, like the substrate common to Casillas' symbolic forms, which are not accessible either, except via one or other of those forms, none of which discloses the whole picture. So, you might think, well, is the philosophy of symbolic forms then a framework for putting Goethe within range of something like Howard's interpenetration of the enterprises of knowledge and understanding, or Michael's dialectical interchange between science and philosophical metascience in his dynamics and reason? This isn't the place to undertake any sort of critique, but just to indicate briefly why I'm inclined to reject that, why I'm inclined not to think that will work. I think Casillas' project leaves the tensions within Goethe's own conception of objectivity, which I don't completely get, but it's probably not very articulate anywhere, and Casillas tries to articulate it, but he leaves those tensions unresolved, I think. And this is something that many people have pointed out. One of the first reviewers of the completed 3-volume treatise when it came out, Konrad Mark-Vogel, already pointed out the basic problem, and it's a long review. Jürgen Habermas later summarized that critique very briefly as follows in this quote. Evidently, the identity of the sense impression as the reference point of various interpretations can only be claimed if a self-sufficient reality, independent of all interpretations, is attributed to that sensory stimulation. But then Casillas would have to allow precisely the separation of form and content that he rightly wants to avoid because of its contradictory consequences. On the other hand, he can't just simply drop the premise of the unity of the real within the manifold of perspectives. For as long as the symbolic forms alone ground objectivity and validity, they have to refer to the same reality. And Habermas adds, today we would put the problem like this. Casillas can't claim both that the different symbolic languages are incommensurable and that they can at least partially be translated into each other. But quite independently of the merits of the philosophy of symbolic forms in itself, there's also the separate question which didn't concern and needn't concern Mark Vogel or Habermas or anybody else who's pointed this out, is the question whether it's a good way of reconciling Goethe with Newtonian science, understanding with knowledge, whatever you want to call it. I've tried to indicate here and there in this talk why there might be reasonable grounds for skepticism, not only about Casillas' more specific diagnosis of Goethe, but more generally about his conception of understanding, even if one doesn't share Mark Vogel's or Habermas's or whoever's doubts about his conception of knowledge, which is what this quotation is about. I think Howard is right both to insist on the supreme importance of understanding and to avoid letting it be pinned down too precisely. It seems to me that thinking about the Goethe case is an interesting exercise in probing the limits to what one might appropriately and acceptably mean by understanding. I do think it's genuinely unclear whether there is a consistent doctrinal core to Goethe's view of science that could be weakened to a program relevant to us. It's certainly tempting to be dismissive like Dubois-Reymond, but one is also given pause by the seriousness with which people of the order of Helmholtz, Ostwalds, and even Casillas, among many others, took Goethe's view of science and give what it's appropriate, I think, to call explications in the Carnapian sense of it. They try to isolate a doctrinal central tendency that can be appropriately weakened to a program relevant to their own contexts. That project seems worth continuing, and a good vehicle for exploring the interpenetration of knowledge and understanding. One reason it's a good vehicle for that is precisely because it's a boundary case. precisely because Goethe is infuriating and tests the limits of what we might be searching for when we seek understanding, or we seek to understand what we mean by understanding. No one said that the relations between the two enterprises will always be harmonious. In the case of Goethe, certainly stretches our tolerance in that respect. Howard himself draws attention to a case where an attempt at understanding goes awry by trying to leave the enterprise of knowledge out of the picture, or tries anyway to leave known scientific achievements out of sight so as not to make us too uncomfortable in our world. Goethe certainly didn't have that problem, at least. But for most philosophers, and certainly scientifically oriented philosophers, he's pretty far out there. He makes us uncomfortable. Not Howard, of course. Nothing makes Howard uncomfortable. One reason, and that's one reason I think, like Helmholtz and Ostwald, that it's worth going on trying to build bridges between these two characters. When C.P. Snow, in apparent ignorance of the prehistory that I've been talking about, gave his famous lecture in the early 60s, he obviously didn't stress the complementarity or the harmony between the two enterprises, between the two tribal cultures that he described. But there he meant the scientific and the literary sort of academic tribes. But rather he stressed their mutual incomprehension and their mutual hostility. And sure enough, he got very hostile responses, notably from F.R. Leavis.
Andre,
but
you've got 15 minutes.
I have one sentence. But nonetheless, there are a few of us, like Howard Stein and Anton Chekhov, who know that it doesn't have to be that way, and would be happy to talk to both of these characters, and perhaps even to explain the merits of each of them to the other.